Unfortunately, we have another panel. I didn't see all the presentation, but something, just a question concerning when we talk about artificial intelligence. For sure, you have your data, and do you use to flash your database, knowledge database, with others' information? Let's say available, as you said, you use food and drugs updates and so on for the drugs. It is real time or in deferred time?
You mean for the clinical decision support of drug interactions?
Yes.
So no, this is, when you mean real time, yes, of course, the patient is directly, and this is individualized for the patient, but then this is coming just only from the records, so from FDA. So
yes,
it's,
so,
it's not
so you
dynamic.
have this update continuously in order to be able to
Yes,
do
of
this.
course. So throughout the day, they've always been talking about now today is about the correct data. So of course, if I'm not updated in my data, which is showing the interaction, then I'm going to reach to the wrong decision.
Okay.
So of course, you have to make sure that you're using the proper data, for example, from the FDA, and it's keeping updated.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. Just I want to ask Mrs. Williams. I want to know more when the startups want to do an application or they want to know more about the accurate data and the accurate percentage from the data. The World Health Organization, from where it gets its own data, from where it gets the right percentage when we want to depend on it, on any research we do it on university, or we want to do a proposal or anything. Just, I need to know a help because I'm doing my own app and I need to know if I can depend on the World Health Organization percentage on the data science topic. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know the validity of the World Health Organization's data. But, so recall and precision rates are how we calculate how well a machine algorithm is working, right? And in order for us to be able to calculate, so recall and precision rates are basically the false positives and false negatives in our predictions relative to a model, right? So we want to be very precise, but we also want to have very good recall. So I would suggest that validation data sets are super important. And we usually use golden masters, where we have one set of data that we keep that is labeled, and we have a very high confidence that that data is labeled very accurately. So when we calculate a new model, or we change something about our model, we'll compare the results to that golden master set of data to verify that the precision and recall rates remain correct, or that we're still producing the appropriate outcomes. So let me give an example for people who aren't necessarily in machine learning. We do a lot of work with de-identification of data. So we'll have a master list of data that says it's fake. It says, here's unstructured data, and we have labeled all of the names, or all of the cities, or all of the birth dates. And we know how many birth dates, names, and cities are in this data set. And we know that it's accurately labeled. So we set that aside, and we build new models for de-identification, and then we use our new model against that golden master data set, and we can, with good recall, we catch everything we expected, and then from a precision standpoint, we see how many things we mislabeled as a name, a city, or something like that, and then we can verify that we were doing this very accurately. So it's important to have that master data set, and this is where I think in healthcare we don't have very good data. So one of there are two data sets that we use that are public data sets. One is Mimic3, which was put out through MIT for a competition, and that's very well labeled data, and it's publicly available. All you have to do is agree to the license terms. And the other is called I2B2. And these are both good data sets for health-related machine learning tests because they're already pre-labeled data sets. Is that helpful?
Thank you. Yes.
I want to add to this one is just indeed there's a lot of effort in the community to do a lot of challenges. So there are a lot of blind data. That means, and I would actually invite everybody, particularly students and also about startups, to participate in those challenges. It's not only big companies, but we really see a lot of startups competing those challenges. Well, you actually you get your testing or your training and testing set, but you also get a complete blind data set that then you get validated. That doesn't mean, just disclaimer, that the data are not noisy or that whatever works on the training will equally work on blind sets and so on. But it's an effort globally that is organizing, availability of data and a common kind of benchmarking when, we can test it and validate what we are doing.
Thank you very much, all of you. And I have a comment and a question for EPICS. You said electronic patient IC record something. So you are starting here as a database. And from Dr. You showed that the data presented is descriptive. Now, if you have so many indicators, you make life of a doctor very difficult. So the question here, aggregating more the data for better decision making. Does your system provide analytics? First question. Second, you are using AUBMC data. Now, patient in Lebanon could be different than patient in US. Do we have access to data so we can conduct comparative analysis? Or use it to your own, to develop your own businesses? So here's a question. Do you have partnership with AUB, whereby we have our own medical hospital and we have our own research team? Then we can advance medical healthcare in the region rather than relying on you, on biased patient in US that they have different characteristics than patient in our field, on our area. And thank you.
Boy, there's a lot in there. I'll start with the easy one. Yes, we have analytics in Epic. The other thing you talk about is really, I think where you were going initially at least, is to capture all this data. If you go overboard, it's a burden on the physicians. So we have a whole team around physician happiness, and we actually have analytics about how the physicians are using the system. So the system is monitoring itself to figure out if the physicians are doing more work than what they need to do. So this is the work that we need to do well, so that it's not a burden, and yet you get the data. So the third thing you asked was more about your own data here at AUBMC compared to data in the US, and that's an excellent question. So the first thing is, we don't own the data for any of our customers. Actually, each organization owns its own data. So it's living here. The second piece about it is making sure that every one of our customers knows how to use the system, how to get at the data. So one of the things that your team did was, a good number of the project team came and lived with us for nearly 9 months to learn the system just as if they were any Epic staff. I think they were indistinguishable from the Epic staff, so that there is no need to go back to Epic to get at your own data, explore it. So there's components of all those things that we think about. And then the fourth thing was kind of training the model, so different populations. We have a good number of data scientists at Epic. They do look at different populations as they are perfecting the models. I guess perfecting is a bad word, improving. And then we also give our customers we call it the cognitive computing development platform, so that they can train their own models. And so then collaboratively we can compare. So if there's something a bit weird about one of our standard models here, then we can work together and figure out how to tune things a little differently for this population. And I do believe that gives you an opportunity to be a leader in this region with the insights you may have. Did I answer those questions?
You are approaching it from development point of view of the software. I am looking at it from development, from treatment side, whereby I would like to generate insight from the data. So I
Yes. Okay.
Different places, using the analytic parts that you are not providing to give you a better insight for you and the rest. And I don't know whether
Really, do you want to answer?
Feel free.
So I get your answer. I get your question because it has two parts. I know we're using data like loosely today, especially now in the healthcare section in the afternoon, because I know from the audience many of you are not data scientists. So the way you're asking is whether me as a hospital I can go to do some analytics and see how am I doing. Yes, this is definitely there in Epic and we can use it. So this is one part. But when we're talking about like data and the algorithm and the machine learning and the artificial and all these buzzwords, we're really talking about understanding. So the data becomes not what helped me in my decision making now today in my hospital for my finance, for my efficiency, for improving policies, etc. We're really talking about like, for the example, for proficiency or efficiency of the physician. So we're really looking about how physicians are using the system so that some data scientists will go into that data and see how they can refine it and help us in guiding us a better algorithm where they can give us decision like, this is the best way to do it. So there are two types of how to manage the data. One which we use on daily basis, which most of us use it like in quality improvements and etc. analytics. But then when the data scientists come, they're really talking about a higher level of how to use the data.
I can tell you from your screen, you are showing bigger scale averages. This assumes that all indicators are in importance, but not all of them are equally important. So when you put importance to an indicator, you change the history. And that's what I'd like to achieve, a higher level of prediction or analytic rather than just descriptive. Imagine if you are a doctor who are having 20 indicators, all of them up and down, you will be get lost.
That's why we...
And your time is very efficient.
Yeah, that's why we need our data scientists to help us to put some predictive models to help us because we cannot, from our regular minds, to make...
I get that point.
The question, please. My question. Thank you for the presentations. My question is for Dr. Antoun. Concerning the electronic medical record, how do you deal with the electronic signature of the user, healthcare users the first, to be accurate, and second, for the patient, you know that in the accreditation, all in Lebanon and everywhere, we have the informed consent to be signed by the physician and by the patient. Did you accept an electronic signature for both, or still for the informed consent it is on paper? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to give the question to my colleague and I will tell her why. Because he's talking about legislations. So he's talking about a place in the world where they still, because we're most of us on paper chart and they do not agree. So I think you're best to talk about how we moved with the technology without having standards.
Sure. So guess what, everybody? A digitized signature, an electronic signature, and a digital signature are three completely different things. Did you? Oh, so one requires cryptography, one requires a scanner, and one requires authentication. And so different countries have written different rules for what constitutes an electronic, digital, or digitized signature. And depending on your country and your region, you may require one or two or three or all of, or none of those things. Or you might require a wet signature on every single document, which is also true in some countries. So it really is dependent on your local jurisdiction and what your requirements and demands are. Now, my first incarnation as an engineer was as a cryptography engineer, as a crypto engineer. So we built cryptographic methods for creating a non-reputable digital signature for documents and email messages and all kinds of things. And that requires a level of infrastructure and a bunch of know-how and capability for people that was overly burdensome for some use cases, like in the healthcare industry. So like in the United States, we have a law that requires that you use a digital signature for certain types of transactions. For example, if you're going to create an FDA medical device and you're going to do some change management and digitally sign a design document that explains that change and how it might affect clinical care, it has to have a cryptographically significant type of digital signature. For electronic medical records, you can use authentication and have a electronic representation of your signature using authentication only, and it was still a qualified signature on a medical record, at least in the United States. So it really depends, again, on what is your local jurisdictional requirement, and there are several methods, right? So when you go to the credit card kiosk at your local bank, and you take out money, and they ask you for a signature on a scratch pad, you know, with the little pen, that's a form of electronic signature that's acceptable to the financial services industry. Healthcare has a different standard as well, and again, it's very dependent on which country you're working in. So I don't know what the law is in Lebanon, but I imagine you're meeting it. Right. Did that answer your question, Iffy? People do that in a lot of places in the United States also. Yeah, it depends. The patient signature is another one, and even in the United States, we're still scanning people's physical signature because you don't have the kiosk with the little signature, and there's not a lot of like precedence for which is liability bearing. Now in the US, that kind of scrawled like you have on a credit card slip is sufficient for even a patient signature. So it depends, again, on what your country requires. But yeah, scanning those records is just a waste of everybody's time because it's not structured data and it doesn't help you very much from an analytic standpoint. Too much information. Again.
Yeah. Hello, everyone here. I have a question that is related to the adequate patient management across Lebanon, actually. And the question is addressed to Dr. Antoun and to Leela. I have attended one meeting that is tackling the digital health in Lebanon, okay? And there's lots of talk about that the patient data is lost when the patient goes from one hospital to another hospital and so on. So my question is, for the EPIC EHR, is it compatible and is it with other EHR used by other hospitals? And there will be any exchange of data across the different hospitals? And the other question, also related, there be any collaboration with the MOH, for example, to put some standards to use the EHR all over Lebanon? Thank you.
Briefly, and then I'll give you the floor. Yes, so the concept you're talking is about interoperability and how the systems will talk to each other. And I think this is a big challenge everywhere, but I think EPIC are, you have 1 or 2 slides on interoperability.
Oh my gosh, I had so many slides I didn't show on this. So where there are standards, it's obviously much easier. So the platform that we use to exchange records across totally different health systems is called Care Everywhere. And we started that even before the standards were there in the United States. And the real hard part actually wasn't the technology for doing this. It was, what are the rules? We call it the rules of the road. To allow people to feel safe having their record be exchanged. What are the assumptions they can have? So crafting those rules and getting every single one of our organizations to sign and abide by that was really the hard work 10, 12 years ago. And then the regulations kind of followed because we became the de facto standard in the United States. The regulators looked at what we were doing to create some of the standards in the United States. So here, the issue likely is there other hospitals don't have systems capable of sending a record. If they do, then at least here they can take it. That's the first step.
Can I make one tiny little point about that? I had a really interesting conversation with a patient one day about health information exchange. And it was this, and it really rocked my world, I'll be honest. And then as a software developer, this is something that stuck with me. She came to me in tears and she said, look, I have a diagnosis of an illness. I don't know if it's real. I want a second opinion. But everywhere I go, they already have my test results. They already have my clinical notes, and it's biasing everybody to say, oh, I'm already diagnosed with this disease. She goes, I just want a fair second opinion. How do I make sure my record doesn't go where I don't want it to go? And so I had always assumed that it was nothing but goodness in sharing information between providers, and that was something that was just something we should always do. But as we have to talk to patients, we have to talk to their families, members who are helping them through these difficult care decisions, and it's a really important part of software design, technical design, and data sharing approaches to really understand all the use cases, both positive and negative, for how you would accommodate for some of these needs, and not always assume that more data is always good for people. Anyway, 99% of the time it's true.
I have a question for Dr. Gabrani from Cognitive Healthcare. Hello, okay. You spoke about the predictive medicine, and you mentioned about the oncology software that helps healthcare provider in decision support. However, because we're talking about cognition, are you working as a company, as IBM, for a predictive model to, in terms of brain health, predicting risk of dementia, where you can read all the brain imaging, software that reads brain imaging and through a certain algorithm or whatever, looking for atrophy, certain areas, and then they can predict for a person, combined with a certain genetic profile, they can predict risk of Alzheimer and dementia. So is IBM working on a certain model or anything like that?
So IBM is a big company, and I know we do. So in my team, we don't have projects in brain imaging. But I know at IBM that we have a lot of activities in brain imaging, so MRI, CT, and so on. And I know that there are also projects in Alzheimer and dementia. But my team is not working, so I cannot tell you exactly what they are doing. But if you're interested, I'm happy to figure out and give you the contacts, certainly.
Hello, my name is Jonathan. First off, I want to say all of your work is incredibly brilliant, and thank you for doing it. I had a question for Ms. Williams and possibly Ms. Vaughn as well. You said it took you 14 months to gather the new data, and Google went out and paid for and acquired that data. Well, whoever did. But the process of doing so probably has benefits to the healthcare industry for how to acquire uniform data for artificial intelligence, and then for incorporate that information with the electronic health reports. I was wondering if there's any collaborative avenues for that happening.
Such a great question. It kind of highlights some of the challenges of obtaining data for machine learning purposes. At least, the example I was speaking of that took 14 months was a research project in the United States. So when you go to a health system and you ask to be able to do human subjects research, which this all qualifies as, it's a pretty arduous process to ensure that all of a person's rights and liberties are preserved. And so the negotiation process to even do, because we're talking about large-scale data, right? Because you can't train a model on tiny bits of data. And most of the, in my opinion, I worked on institutional review boards for a while. I was the privacy reviewer for a lot of data projects. Most of those projects involved a couple hundred records, maybe a couple thousand records, but not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records. The apparatus for clinical research is actually not particularly well designed for very large data projects like that, especially if there's any identifiers like zip code or dates of service or things like that that would be relevant but are still considered identifiable everywhere. So that negotiation process is protracted, because you have to establish that you're going to provide some sort of benefit to the patients that are involved, and you have to prove that there's not going to be a potential for harm for those patients that are involved. They're going to validate that your protocol for delivering that, for performing your task is appropriate. There's going to be a clinical review, there's going to be a regulatory review, there's going to be a safety review, and it's just a very protracted process, especially to get very large quantities of data, because there's so much liability and risk for the organization that gifts it to you. Now, that you asked really is, that was hard, so why can't we make it more widely available? Research projects, when they're approved, are approved for a specific protocol, for a specific use case, and at the end of it, you have to return and destroy that data. You don't get to keep it, and you don't get to decide how to share it more broadly. So our collaborations do involve a lot of third parties, but they come in as fellows or residents or somebody who's going to come and work with us on the research so that they can be a party to those arrangements. But it's actually quite difficult to create that data set and then make it more broadly available. And partly it's because de-identification is nearly impossible. And anybody who's tried to make a really large de-identified data set out of healthcare data and publish it for public use cases has gotten burned pretty good, right? Because it's almost impossible to get it completely right, and you're 100% accountable if you get it wrong. So there's not a huge incentive to put out big data sets for more broad usage if there's any potential for that data to be not perfectly cleansed. Did that help answer the question? It's just, it's very limited use cases, and you can't just add new third parties to the approval process. So you kind of have to come in and be part of our workforce before we can help.
The added part of the question was if you develop techniques that could be beneficial for future surveys to make more uniform machine learning ready databases.
Right, we talked a little bit about transfer learning, and we've actually released quite a number of the machine learning algorithms that might be useful. So like Deep Variant is a genomics sequencing algorithm that we released through GitHub so that anybody can leverage and use that for their own additional training purposes. So we released quite a number of the machine learning algorithms we think would be generally useful, because we can train those on large data sets because we have access to them, but others don't. We can release those models, and then it's a stepping stone for your additional training efforts. But we release those through GitHub fairly routinely. Is that, yeah.
Well, let us thank our speakers in the digital health and AI track. Thank you very much.
Thank you.